It started on what should have been an ordinary Sunday dinner. The table was set, the roast was warm, and laughter should have filled the air. Instead, the sound that stayed with me was sharper than any knife. My daughter-in-law's voice. "You never really taught him boundaries, did you? That's why he struggles as an adult." The words landed like a slap, right there in front of my family. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile and swallowed the pain, pretending I wasn't wounded. But later, in the silence of my room, her judgment echoed louder than the clinking of silverware ever had. I thought back to the years of sacrifice. The sleepless nights, the double shifts, the countless ways I tried to give my children a better life. And yet, with one sentence, she made it sound as if all of it had been meaningless. That was the night everything shifted. What felt like a wound of humiliation would, in time, become the spark that changed the entire course of my life. So let's get into what happened after that Sunday night, because that moment at the table didn't just pass. It stayed with me. In the days that followed, I carried her words around like a heavy bag slung across my shoulder. No matter what I was doing, washing dishes, folding laundry, or reading the news, her voice would creep back in. I told myself not to take it personally. After all, every generation sees the one before it as flawed in some way. But it wasn't just criticism. It was the way she said it, the certainty in her tone, as if she had studied me long enough to form a judgment, and now she was announcing it for everyone to hear. My son sat beside her in silence, and that silence pierced deeper than her words. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had been ignoring a pattern. This wasn't the first time she had chipped away at me. Over the years, there had been subtle digs, comments about how I cooked, how I spoke, even how I spent my weekends. Each time I brushed it off, thinking it was just her way, or maybe even my own sensitivity. But now, in front of the family, she'd turned what was once quiet disapproval into a public statement. That night, I hardly slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind running through scenes of the past. I remembered teaching my kids how to ride bikes, how to cook their first meals, how to face rejection with courage. I remembered the look in their eyes when they were small and thought I could fix anything. Those memories clashed violently with her accusation that I had failed at the most important job of all, raising them into strong adults. The days dragged. I tried distracting myself with routines, grocery shopping, calling old friends, working on small projects around the house. But every task was colored by the same bitter thought that my efforts as a mother had been dismissed. I realized something inside me had shifted. I couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. At first, I didn't even know why I had pulled it out, but I began writing down moments from my parenting years, not in polished sentences, just in fragments. The time I drove my son to practice in the rain, the time I stayed up sewing a costume for a school play, the long talks I had with my daughter about self-worth. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. It was as if I was building evidence, not to convince her, but to remind myself that I had shown up again and again. Writing became my quiet rebellion. Instead of replaying her words, I started replaying my memories, this time on paper. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. It felt private, almost sacred. At first, I wrote only in the evenings, but soon it spread into mornings and afternoons. Whenever doubt crept in, I reached for the notebook. Oak. Still, I couldn't deny the lingering sting. Every time I saw my son and daughter-in-law, I braced myself for another remark. I tried to keep conversations light, to avoid giving her any opening, but that silence between us grew heavier. The tension was invisible, but undeniable. I caught myself replaying our exchanges later, dissecting them for hidden criticism. I hated that I had given her so much power in my mind. One day, I stumbled across an article online about women who reinvent themselves later in life. Some became writers, some speakers, some coaches. I read their stories with fascination. These weren't people with perfect lives or unshakable confidence. They were people who had been knocked down, dismissed, or overlooked, and had decided to rise again in new ways. Something inside me clicked. For the first time, I thought, maybe this is my moment to stop defending my past and start building something new. The thought scared me. I had never considered myself ambitious in that way. My role had always been to support others, not to put myself in the spotlight. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If my parenting was going to be scrutinized, why not tell my own story? On my own terms. At first, the idea was vague, like a shadow I couldn't quite grasp, but it wouldn't leave me alone. I kept imagining what it would feel like to stand firm and say, I did my best, and here's what I learned. Not as a defense, but as a message that might help someone else. I began to research late at night, long after the house was quiet. I read about life coaching, about parenting approaches that focused not just on children, but on how adults can grow and heal too. Each page I read felt like fuel. For the first time in months, I wasn't weighed down. I was curious, energized. Of course, I didn't tell my family at first. They would have laughed, or worse, dismiss it as another phase. This was something I needed to hold close until I was ready. I carried the secret like a small ember, keeping it safe from the cold winds of doubt. Looking back, that was the true beginning. Not the insult, not the sleepless nights, but the moment I decided to shift the story from what she said about me to what I would do next. I didn't know then just how far that ember would spread, but I knew one thing. I was no longer willing to let her voice be louder than my own. The ember I carried inside me began to change the way I moved through my days. At first, it was small things. I noticed I wasn't apologizing as quickly when someone disagreed with me. I wasn't rushing to soften my words or cover over silence. Instead, I let conversations hang, giving myself time to consider whether I truly needed to answer at all. It was strange at first, almost uncomfortable, but it also gave me a new kind of calm. I kept writing in my notebook, but now the words were less about defending my past and more about imagining a future. What would it look like if I stopped letting guilt and judgment guide me? What if I started creating a life that belonged to me, not just to my children or to other people's opinions? That question sat with me, stirring something restless and alive. One afternoon, I pulled out an old box from the closet. Inside were letters, photographs, school projects, little reminders of years gone by. As I sifted through them, I felt both proud and unsettled. Proud because I saw the evidence of my devotion, but unsettled because I realized how much of myself I had left behind in those years. My children's growth was carefully documented, but my own story was missing. Somewhere between packing lunches and working long shifts, I had forgotten to keep track of my own dreams. That realization pushed me deeper into research. I read about women in their 50s and 60s starting second careers, launching small businesses, even becoming coaches. Their paths weren't polished or perfect, but they showed me what was possible. I started to imagine myself among them, not as an outsider watching from the edges, but as someone stepping into the same current. The hardest part wasn't believing in new beginnings. It was quieting the doubts that came from years of self-sacrifice. I heard echoes in my mind. You're too old. You're not trained. People won't take you seriously. Each time those thoughts rose up, I reminded myself of all the times I had figured things out before. I hadn't known how to be a mother until I was 1. I hadn't known how to survive setbacks until they happened. Why should this be different? Still, the fear of failure lingered. I imagined telling my children about my new direction and hearing laughter or polite nods that carried no real belief. I didn't want to hand them another reason to doubt me. So I decided to build quietly, brick by brick, until what I was creating felt too solid to dismiss. I enrolled in an online course on personal development. At first, I felt completely out of place. Most of the participants were younger, comfortable with technology, quick with their responses. I felt clumsy, like I had stepped into a room where everyone else spoke a language I barely understood. But instead of quitting, I leaned into that discomfort. I asked questions, I practiced, and I took notes the way I used to help my children with their homework. Slowly, the lessons began to sink in. What surprised me most wasn't the information itself, but the way it started changing my mindset. I began to notice the patterns in my own thinking, the ways I had let criticism control me, the ways I had accepted limits without even realizing it. The more I learned, the more I saw how much of my life could still be shaped, even now. I began practicing small exercises from the course. One asked me to speak affirmations aloud, something that felt silly at first. But as I repeated those sentences, I realized how rarely I had spoken kindly to myself. Another exercise encouraged me to visualize conversations where I held my ground. The next time I saw my daughter-in-law, I tried it in real life. I didn't argue, but I also didn't shrink. I simply answered her comments with steady confidence. For the first time, I walked away from that interaction without replaying it endlessly in my head. That small victory fueled me more than I expected. It wasn't dramatic, but it showed me that change was possible. I began to wonder if this was what coaching could feel like for others. Not solving everything at once, but offering tools that made a difference in everyday struggles. At night, I started sketching out ideas for what I might do with this new direction. I pictured working with women who felt overlooked, who were questioning their worth after years of giving to others. I thought about sharing the tools that were helping me: journaling, reframing, quiet confidence in hard conversations. I didn't know exactly what form it would take, but the vision was becoming clearer. Of course, I also wrestled with guilt. Was I being selfish for focusing on myself now? Was I neglecting my role as a mother and grandmother? Those questions surfaced often, but I began to answer them differently. I reminded myself that my children were grown, building their own paths. My job now wasn't to carry them, but to show them what resilience looked like. Perhaps the best legacy I could leave was not just the sacrifices I had made for them, but the strength I had found for myself. The turning point came when I joined a virtual community of women on similar journeys. For the first time, I didn't feel isolated. These women spoke openly about reinvention, about struggles with confidence, about balancing family expectations with personal dreams. Their honesty gave me courage. When I shared my story, about the comment at the dinner table, about the years of feeling invisible, I was met with nods, not judgment. One woman messaged me afterward and said, "You've put into words what I've been carrying silently for years." That one sentence made all the late nights and doubts feel worth it. I realized then that my story had weight, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And if it could give someone else comfort or courage, maybe that was the next chapter I had been searching for. So I set a quiet intention. I would keep learning, keep writing, and one day I would step fully into the role of a guide, not just for my family, but for others who needed it. I didn't tell anyone out loud, but inside, I had made a choice. I was no longer just reacting to her judgment. I was building something new, one step at a time. The shift inside me was real, but it couldn't stay hidden forever. Quiet growth is one thing, but life has a way of testing whether you're ready to live out what you've been practicing. For me, that test came sooner than I expected. It started with an invitation. My son and his wife asked me to join a weekend gathering with their friends. Normally, I would have found a way to avoid it, offering some excuse about being too tired or needing to catch up on housework. Crowds made me uneasy, and being around her friends always left me feeling small. But this time, something inside urged me to say yes. Not because I was suddenly eager to mingle, but because I wanted to see if the work I'd been doing in private could stand in the open. And the evening came. I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. I wasn't looking for anything glamorous, just something that felt like me. For years, I had dressed to disappear, choosing clothes that wouldn't draw comment or attention. But that night, I reached for a simple blouse in a color I hadn't worn in years. It wasn't flashy, but it felt honest. For the first time, I wasn't dressing to blend in or to please anyone else. I was dressing to remind myself that I was still here. The gathering was held at a friend's home, filled with easy laughter and casual conversation. I felt the old nerves rising as soon as I walked in. The room buzzed with energy, and I wondered if I had made a mistake. My daughter-in-law greeted me warmly, but her eyes lingered on me just long enough to trigger the familiar insecurity. I almost slipped back into silence, into that safe corner I had carved for myself for so many years. But I remembered the small victories I had practiced: steady breathing, clear responses, letting silence be my ally. So when someone asked me what I had been up to lately, I didn't brush it off or deflect the question. I didn't make myself invisible. I told them honestly that I had been taking courses and exploring new directions. The words felt heavy on my tongue at first, but then lighter, almost freeing. A few people nodded politely, but one woman leaned in with genuine curiosity and asked me more. We ended up talking about how women often reinvent themselves later in life, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't shrinking in a group setting. I was participating. That night didn't end with applause or fireworks. I still stumbled over words, still second-guessed myself afterward. But the difference was that I had shown up. I had stood in the light instead of the corner, and that mattered. What followed in the weeks after was even more important. I realized that moments like those were the true tests of change, not the quiet journaling or the late-night studying, but the way I carried myself when others were watching. It was in how I answered questions, how I chose to see myself, how I refused to let old stories dictate my new actions. Of course, not everyone welcomed this version of me. My daughter-in-law noticed. Her comments grew sharper in subtle ways, as if testing whether I would slip back into the role she had grown comfortable with. When I mentioned an idea from one of my courses, she brushed it off with a quick remark about self-help fads. In the past, I would have let that bury me in shame. This time, I simply smiled and said, "It's been helpful for me." Nothing more, nothing less. The conversation moved on, and for the first time, I didn't feel wounded. This was the balance I was learning. Not to fight every dismissal, not to chase her approval, but to stand firm in what I knew to be true. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about no longer abandoning myself. That quiet strength began to carry into other parts of my life. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping women with basic writing and job applications. At first, I told myself it was just to give back, but I quickly realized it was also a kind of training ground. Each time I encouraged someone else, I felt my own confidence deepening. The women I worked with reminded me of myself in different stages of life, hesitant, unsure, carrying invisible burdens. I found that the words I had struggled to tell myself flowed out naturally when I was supporting others. It was as though the act of guiding them reinforced the very lessons I was still learning. Then came the day when my son asked me directly, "Mom, what are you really doing with all this coaching stuff?" His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried genuine curiosity mixed with doubt. For a split second, I almost gave him the easy answer, that it was just a hobby, nothing serious. But I stopped myself. Instead, I told him the truth, that I was exploring a path that mattered to me, one that allowed me to take my experiences and turn them into something useful for others. His reaction surprised me. He didn't laugh and he didn't dismiss it. He just nodded slowly and said, "If it makes you happy, that's what counts." That single sentence lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For so long, I had feared that my children would see my efforts as a distraction or a failure. Hearing even a small thread of support reminded me that this journey didn't have to be done in secret. That moment shifted something. I no longer felt like I was sneaking around, trying to justify myself in private. I started speaking more openly about what I was learning and where I wanted to go. I wasn't shouting it from rooftops, but I wasn't hiding either. Looking back, it wasn't one grand transformation that marked my progress. It was a collection of small decisions, each one a step away from invisibility and toward a more grounded version of myself. Saying yes to a gathering, wearing a blouse that reflected me instead of someone else's taste, answering questions with honesty, helping strangers at the community center, speaking plainly to my son. Each of these moments stitched together into a new pattern, one where my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's opinion. And though I still felt nervous about the road ahead, I knew something for certain. The life I was building now was mine, and no one could take that away from me. The changes I had been making inside myself eventually reached a point where keeping them hidden was no longer possible. Quiet progress had given me strength, but now it was time to step into something larger. I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did. It unfolded almost by accident. But looking back, it was the exact push I needed. At the community center where I volunteered, one of the coordinators asked me to help fill in for a speaker who had canceled. It wasn't a formal seminar, just a small group session about building confidence during job interviews. Normally, I would have declined immediately, insisting I wasn't ready or qualified. But before the words could even leave my mouth, I heard myself agreeing. My heart sank the moment I realized what I had just committed to, but there was no turning back. In the days leading up to it, I felt the familiar pull of self-doubt. I told myself I wasn't an expert, that I had no right to stand in front of others and give advice. Yet, at the same time, I kept remembering all the women I had spoken to one-on-one. I had been guiding them, encouraging them, sharing lessons that came from my own journey. Maybe I didn't need a title or certificate to offer something valuable. Maybe my lived experience was enough. On the day of the session, I arrived early. The room was modest, just a few chairs, a whiteboard, and a circle of faces waiting to hear something useful. As I stood at the front, my palms damp and my pulse quickening, I almost froze. But then, instead of reciting some polished script, I simply spoke the truth. I told them I understood what it felt like to walk into a room and feel invisible. I knew the sting of being overlooked, the frustration of being dismissed before even finishing a sentence. And I shared how I had been working to change that piece by piece. Something shifted as I talked. People nodded. Some even smiled with recognition. The fear in my chest didn't vanish, but it loosened. I realized they weren't expecting perfection. They just wanted honesty and something they could hold on to. So I gave practical suggestions, ways to steady themselves before speaking, how to prepare simple responses, how to remind themselves that they had worth even if others failed to see it. When it was over, no one clapped. This wasn't that kind of event. But one woman came up to me afterward, eyes steady, and said, "That helped. I needed to hear it today." Those words landed deeper than any applause ever could. I walked home with my shoulders lighter than they had been in years. That moment marked the start of something I couldn't ignore anymore. I began to imagine what it might look like if I did more of this. Not just as a volunteer filling in when needed, but as a calling. It scared me to even think of it. Who was I to step into that space? Yet the seed had been planted, and once it was there, I couldn't unsee it. At home, I wrestled with the idea quietly. I didn't broadcast it, not even to my son or his wife. I wasn't ready for their opinions, supportive or otherwise. Instead, I started preparing in silence. I read more about facilitation, practiced speaking out loud when no one was around, even recorded myself to listen back and catch the parts that felt unsure. I wasn't polishing myself into someone I wasn't. I was simply learning how to bring my own voice forward without hesitation. My first real chance came a month later. The community center asked me to run a short workshop on building confidence for women re-entering the workforce. It wasn't paid, but it was official. A flyer went up, my name printed at the bottom as the facilitator. When I saw it, my chest tightened with both fear and pride. It was one thing to help quietly. It was another to stand up publicly and claim that a role I never thought I could fill. The night before the workshop, I barely slept. My mind replayed every worst-case scenario. What if no one showed up? What if I stumbled over my words? What if they realized I had no right to be there? But alongside the fear was a voice that had grown louder over the past months. You've been preparing for this without even knowing it. Just show up as you are. On the day, 10 women arrived. 10 pairs of eyes looking at me, waiting. I started slowly, introducing myself, admitting openly that I wasn't some polished expert, but someone who had walked the same struggles they were facing. That honesty broke the tension, and the room softened. We shared stories, practiced small exercises, and laughed at the awkwardness together. By the end, the women were encouraging each other, offering support and standing a little taller. As I wrapped up, I realized something important. This wasn't about me giving them all the answers. It was about creating a space where they could see themselves differently. That was what I had longed for in my own life. Someone to tell me I wasn't invisible, that my voice mattered. Now, I was offering that to others. When the session ended, one of the women lingered to say, "You should keep doing this. We need more people like you." Those words stayed with me. I walked out of the center not as someone pretending to be confident, but as someone beginning to believe she had a role to play. That night, for the first time, I told my son about it. We sat at the kitchen table, and I explained what I had done, how nervous I had been, and how meaningful it felt afterward. He listened, and when I finished, he gave me a look I hadn't seen in years, a mix of surprise and respect. "Mom," he said, "that's incredible. You really did that?" I nodded, and he shook his head with a smile. "I'm proud of you." Hearing that from him, the very person I had once been so afraid of disappointing, was a turning point. It didn't erase every insecurity, but it gave me permission to keep going. From there, the path wasn't smooth. There were still setbacks, moments where my voice shook, times when self-doubt crept in. But each workshop, each conversation, each small step reminded me that I had crossed a line I could never go back behind. I wasn't the woman shrinking in corners anymore. I was someone showing up, even when it scared me. And perhaps the most powerful part was this: the more I helped others, the more I healed myself. Every time I stood in front of a group, I wasn't just speaking to them. I was also speaking to the version of me that had once believed she had no worth. Each session was a way of saying, out loud and without apology, that I was still here and I wasn't going to disappear again. The more I stepped into this new role, the more visible I became, and with visibility came scrutiny. It wasn't long before the excitement of leading workshops collided with a harder truth. Not everyone wanted to see me grow. It started with small remarks. After one of the sessions, I overheard two women whispering that I wasn't professional enough. They said my advice was too simple, that anyone could have given it. Their words weren't even meant for me, but they cut deep all the same. For days, I replayed them in my head, wondering if I had made a fool of myself. The doubt grew louder when the center director suggested I attend a formal training program before taking on more workshops. She phrased it kindly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw me as an amateur playing at something serious. My chest tightened with the fear that maybe she was right. Who was I, really, to be teaching others when I had no certificate, no degree, nothing but my own lived experiences? At home, the conflict deepened. My daughter-in-law, though polite, began dropping hints that I was spending a lot of time at the center when I could be more useful with family responsibilities. She never said it outright, but I felt the weight of her disapproval. The unspoken judgment returned me to old patterns, shrinking, second-guessing, questioning whether I had the right to want more than what I already had. But something was different this time. Instead of collapsing entirely, I gave myself space to think. Late one night, I sat alone at the kitchen table and asked myself if their doubts truly canceled out what I had seen and felt during those workshops. I pictured the faces of the women I had worked with, the way their posture changed when they felt heard, the way their voices steadied after practice. That was real. It wasn't theory, and it wasn't nothing. Still, the sting of criticism lingered. I knew I needed to decide whether to step back quietly or push forward. The turning point came during a follow-up session at the center. A woman I had worked with before returned to tell me she had landed a job after months of failed interviews. Her voice trembled with emotion as she said, "I remembered what you told me, to stop apologizing for taking up space." That made the difference. Those words silenced the noise in my head. Whatever others thought of me, this woman's success was proof that I was making an impact. I realized then that waiting for universal approval was pointless. If I wanted to keep growing, I had to accept that some people would doubt me, and that their opinions couldn't outweigh the evidence of real change in front of me. So, I decided to take the director's suggestion not as a dismissal, but as a challenge. I enrolled in a short training program on facilitation skills. It wasn't easy. Sitting in a classroom again after so many years felt strange, almost unnatural. Surrounded by people younger than me, I often felt out of place. But I pushed through the discomfort, reminding myself that this wasn't about being perfect. It was about strengthening what I had already started. There were moments during the program when old fears resurfaced. During practice sessions, I stumbled over my words and felt my face heat as others looked on. I wanted to disappear, but I forced myself to stay. Each time I survived those awkward moments, I grew a little sturdier. By the end, I wasn't flawless, but I was no longer paralyzed by self-consciousness. When I completed the program, the certificate in my hand didn't magically erase my doubts, but it gave me a small anchor. It was proof, for anyone who questioned me, that I wasn't just improvising. More importantly, it was proof to myself that I could learn, adapt, and keep moving. The next workshop I led after the training was different. I didn't try to sound polished or impress anyone with big words. I leaned into what I had always done best, speaking honestly, connecting, and listening. But this time, I did it with steadier footing. When someone asked me a question I didn't know the answer to, instead of freezing, I admitted it openly and guided the group toward finding resources together. To my surprise, people respected the honesty more than any rehearsed answer. At home, the tension with my daughter-in-law didn't vanish, but my reaction to it shifted. When she hinted again that I should focus more on family, I didn't snap back or retreat into guilt. I simply said, "I'm doing this because it matters to me, and I believe it's helping others." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Not defensive, not apologetic, just firm. She didn't argue. In fact, she looked startled, as if she was seeing a version of me she hadn't expected. Even my son, who had been quietly supportive, began to ask me more about the sessions. He wanted to know what I was teaching, what stories I was hearing, what changes I was noticing in people. Those conversations were small, but each one reminded me that he was no longer looking at me only as his mother who cooked meals and kept the house running. He was seeing me as a person with a role beyond the walls of our home. Of course, the criticisms didn't disappear. There were always whispers, doubts, and the occasional dismissive remark. But instead of taking them as proof that I should quit, I started seeing them as background noise. They were there, but they didn't define me. What defined me were the women who walked into those rooms uncertain and walked out standing taller. One evening, after a long day, I caught myself smiling in the mirror. It wasn't a smile of vanity or pride, but one of recognition. I saw a woman who had once believed she had nothing to offer, and now was steadily proving herself wrong. The battles hadn't ended. They never would. But I was no longer afraid of them. And that was the breakthrough I didn't see coming. Growth wasn't just about the workshops or certificates. It was about how I carried myself in the quiet moments when doubt tried to creep back in. It was about not folding under criticism, not abandoning my path the second someone questioned me. It was about finally choosing to believe that my presence mattered, even when it made others uncomfortable. The shift came quietly, almost without warning. One evening after a workshop, the director of the center pulled me aside. She told me a local women's organization had heard about the sessions and wanted me to speak at their upcoming event. My first instinct was disbelief. I actually looked over my shoulder to make sure she was talking to me. The invitation felt unreal. For years, my world had been small, confined to household routines and the occasional social gathering. Now, I was being asked to step onto a stage in front of strangers who expected me to have something valuable to say. The thought filled me with excitement and fear in equal measure. At home, I kept the news to myself for several days. I wasn't sure how my family would respond. Part of me wanted to savor it privately, to keep the possibility intact before it could be questioned or dismissed. But eventually, I told my son and daughter-in-law. My son's face lit up with pride while my daughter-in-law raised her eyebrows in surprise. She didn't criticize outright, but her silence carried the weight of skepticism. It stung, though not as much as it once would have. I was beginning to accept that not everyone needed to understand. Preparing for the event was unlike anything I had done before. A workshop felt intimate, like a conversation around a table. A speech in front of a hall full of people was something else entirely. I spent hours drafting my notes, then scrapping them, then starting again. I kept worrying about whether I had enough to offer, whether my story would matter to people who didn't know me. One night, overwhelmed, I nearly decided to call the director and decline. But then I remembered the woman who had landed a job after following my advice. I thought about the women who stayed back after workshops to thank me, the ones who told me I made them feel seen. Those memories reminded me that my words didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to be real. On the day of the event, my hands trembled as I pinned my scarf. My son offered to drive me, and for once I let him. Walking into the hall, I felt the weight of all the doubts that had trailed me for years. The crowd wasn't massive, but to me, it looked overwhelming. I stood backstage, heart racing, telling myself not to run. When my name was called, I took a deep breath and stepped out. The lights were harsh, the room silent. For a brief second, every insecurity I had ever carried tried to drag me down. But then I locked eyes with a woman in the front row who gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "Go on." I began speaking, slowly at first, sharing how I once believed I had nothing left to contribute, how I thought age and circumstance had closed every door. As the words left my mouth, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. I told them about the workshops, about listening to women who had been ignored for too long, about discovering that confidence wasn't a gift, but a skill that could be built. The more I spoke, the more natural it felt. Laughter broke out when I described my awkward first attempt at leading a group. Heads nodded when I spoke of self-doubt. A hush fell when I admitted how much I used to apologize for existing in the room. By the time I finished, I no longer felt like an imposter. I felt like a messenger of something bigger than myself. When the applause came, it startled me. People stood, clapping and smiling, some even with tears in their eyes. I had imagined indifference at best, rejection at worst. Instead, I had been heard. Afterward, several women approached me to thank me personally. One said she had been considering giving up on her small business, but now felt encouraged to keep going. Another admitted she had avoided opportunities because she thought she was too old to start over, and my story had challenged that belief. Their words were a mirror, showing me the impact of speaking honestly about my own struggles. The recognition extended beyond that evening. A local newspaper published a short piece about the event, mentioning my talk. Friends from the neighborhood who had never paid much attention to my activities suddenly reached out with congratulations. Then relatives who had once dismissed my workshops called to say they were proud. At home, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. My daughter-in-law, who had once hinted I was wasting time, began asking questions about the women I worked with. She wanted to know what they were learning, how they were changing. It wasn't exactly praise, but it was engagement, and that was new. My son's pride, on the other hand, was open. He told me he had shown the newspaper article to his friends, and for the first time in years, I saw in his eyes the same kind of admiration I used to feel for him when he achieved something big. But recognition brought new pressure. With it came invitations to more events, and with those, expectations. I realized quickly that this wasn't just about me anymore. People were looking to me for guidance, for courage, for proof that change was possible at any stage of life. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on my shoulders. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I could live up to it. What if I stumbled? What if one wrong word undid everything? The fear was still there, but now it had to compete with something stronger. The evidence that I had already made a difference. The next time I stood before a crowd, I carried that balance with me, fear in one hand, determination in the other. I no longer needed to be fearless. I just needed to keep showing up. That was the lesson I hadn't expected. Recognition wasn't the end of doubt. It was the beginning of a new kind of test. The difference was that I no longer faced it from a place of silence. I faced it with a voice that had finally found its ground. After that first round of recognition, life didn't return to how it was before. Instead, things began to stretch in directions I hadn't imagined. Invitations came more frequently, and with them came encounters with younger women who were just starting out in their careers or trying to find their footing in life. At first, I felt unsure about whether I could connect with them. Their world seemed so different from mine. Technology-driven, fast-paced, full of ambitions that I hadn't grown up with. But once conversations began, I realized the struggles were often the same. Fear of not being good enough, pressure from family, the uncertainty of taking risks. One afternoon after a workshop, a young woman named Mariam approached me. She looked barely older than my granddaughter, but her voice carried a tremor I recognized instantly. She told me she wanted to launch a small business but felt torn between her own vision and her parents' expectations. Listening to her was like listening to a younger version of myself, someone still waiting for permission to take up space. That moment shifted something in me. I understood that the path I had carved out for myself wasn't just about women my age. It had relevance across generations. I began to stay longer after events, offering to meet one-on-one with women who wanted advice. Sometimes we sat in coffee shops, sometimes in quiet corners of community centers. These conversations weren't formal, but they were meaningful. I would ask questions no one else seemed to ask them. What do you really want? What are you afraid of losing? What would happen if you tried anyway? Their answers reminded me of my own hidden fears, but they also showed me how universal those struggles were. Gradually, word spread that I was someone you could talk to when you were stuck. Young women started messaging me on social media, asking for guidance. I was now fluent with every platform, but my son helped me set up a simple page where people could reach out. The messages poured in, stories of hesitation, ambition, and conflict. Some wanted reassurance before quitting a job they hated. Others wanted to know how to negotiate at work without feeling like they were being difficult. I didn't have all the answers, but I gave them what I could: honesty, perspective, and the reminder that their doubts didn't make them weak. Meanwhile, at home, things grew complicated. The more time I spent mentoring and attending events, the more my absence was noticed. My daughter-in-law began to comment on how often I was away during the week. Sometimes she phrased it as concern, asking if I was overexerting myself, but I could hear the edge in her tone. The unspoken message was clear. This wasn't how she thought a woman my age should spend her days. My son stood in the middle, trying to balance support with domestic peace. He continued to encourage me, even offering to drive me when events were far, but I could see the tension it created in the household. There were nights when I questioned whether I was pushing too far, whether my newfound purpose was worth the discomfort it was stirring at home. But each time I sat with a young woman and heard her say she felt less alone because of me, I knew stepping back wasn't an option anymore. The turning point came when a university invited me to speak to a group of students. Walking into that lecture hall was daunting. Rows of young faces, skeptical and restless. For a moment, I worried my words wouldn't land. But as I told my story, weaving in the lessons I had learned about doubt and resilience, I watched their expressions shift. Phones were set aside, eyes lifted. When the talk ended, students lined up to ask questions, some of them shaking as they shared their own fears. That day convinced me that my voice had value beyond my immediate circle. From then on, I made it a point to bridge the generational gap. I started blending stories of my experiences with practical steps the younger women could take. How to handle being overlooked in meetings, how to assert boundaries without guilt, how to recognize when fear was disguising itself as being sensible. I didn't pretend to have the ultimate answers, but I gave them what I had: proof that self-doubt could be survived and even transformed. The role of mentor brought joy, but also responsibility. I had to guard against becoming a figure who only spoke of strength while hiding my own struggles. There were days I still felt small, days when criticism hit harder than it should, days when I longed for the quiet simplicity of my old life. I began to share those truths as well, telling younger women that resilience didn't mean never wavering. It meant moving forward even when you questioned yourself. They seemed to appreciate that honesty more than any polished advice. At home, the shift was gradual, but real. My daughter-in-law, though still cautious, began to see the impact. Once, while preparing dinner, she mentioned that one of her colleagues had read about my work online. There was a flicker of pride in her tone that she quickly tried to hide. My grandchildren, on the other hand, embraced it fully. They would ask me about the girls I talked to and sometimes sit beside me while I responded to messages. Their curiosity felt like a bridge between my world and theirs. Yet recognition from outside and cautious acceptance at home didn't erase the challenges. There were times when I felt stretched thin, carrying the weight of others' expectations while trying not to lose sight of my own needs. I had to learn, sometimes the hard way, that saying yes to every request would only drain me. Setting boundaries became my new lesson, one I had to teach myself before I could pass it on. Still, despite the exhaustion, I kept moving forward. The younger women I mentored often reminded me why it mattered. When Mariam finally launched her business, she called to tell me she had taken the leap because of one question I asked her months earlier. When another young woman received her first promotion after years of being overlooked, she sent me a message saying, I heard your voice in my head during the meeting." Those moments carried me through the harder days. Looking back, I realized the journey had taken me from being someone who once doubted her place in the world to someone helping others claim theirs. It wasn't about titles or recognition anymore. It was about ensuring that no woman, whether 50 or 20, had to carry her doubts alone. So let's get into what happened next, the moment when the thrill of recognition met the reality of personal sacrifice. The weeks after my first speaking engagements were busy, more than I had anticipated. My calendar was filled with workshops, small meetups, and one-on-one sessions. Every time I returned home, I noticed subtle shifts in the household atmosphere. My daughter-in-law's comments had become more frequent, veiled critiques about how late I stayed out or how I neglected certain responsibilities. At first, I tried to justify it to myself, thinking she didn't understand the importance of what I was doing. But slowly, I began to see that her irritation was rooted not just in logistics, but in discomfort. My expanding world was challenging the boundaries she had always assumed I would accept. The first real confrontation came on a Saturday morning. I had returned from a workshop where I had spent the previous evening helping young women draft personal development plans. I walked into the kitchen to find my daughter-in-law stacking dishes in a meticulous, almost ritualistic way. She looked up and asked where I had been. I told her the truth, that I had spent the evening mentoring. Her eyes narrowed, and she muttered that she didn't think it was necessary for me to spend so much time in other people's business. I could feel my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the old, familiar frustration of being dismissed. I wanted to explain the impact, the gratitude, the changes I had witnessed, but I knew that no words could bridge that gap in that moment. Instead, I took a deep breath and said simply that it was important to me. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, but also honest. It was a reminder that growth often comes with tension, and that those closest to us may resist changes they don't understand. That tension lingered, but I refused to shrink back. I started setting clearer boundaries for myself, deciding which evenings were reserved for mentorship and which days were for home. It wasn't easy. It required careful negotiation and sometimes quiet defiance. There were nights I returned home to subtle remarks about how I prioritized strangers over family, but I reminded myself that my growth didn't diminish my love for them. It simply meant I was claiming space that had long been denied. At the same time, I began to see another side of the impact. Younger women I mentored were thriving, sharing stories of small victories that rippled outward. One woman, Layla, told me she had finally confronted her manager about unfair treatment, citing lessons she had learned from our discussions about confidence and self-respect. Another, Salma, shared theirs. She had applied for a leadership program she had thought was beyond her reach. Each story brought joy, but also a pang of responsibility. I realized that people were counting on me to maintain my presence, my guidance, my energy. Managing that responsibility required discipline I hadn't needed before. I kept journals, noting each interaction, reflecting on the lessons I wanted to reinforce. I carved out early mornings for reading and planning, late evenings for reviewing messages. My home life and my growing public role began to exist in parallel tracks, sometimes intersecting, sometimes diverging. I found balance in structure, in rhythm, in the deliberate choice to honor both realms of my life. Yet even with careful planning, conflict emerged. My son occasionally tried to mediate, reminding us both of mutual respect. He would tell his wife that my mentoring work mattered and that they should support it, but the tension was palpable. There were times when I felt torn, wondering if my pursuit of empowerment was inadvertently creating distance from the family I still loved. Those moments were the hardest. I knew I couldn't retreat. I had invested too much in myself and the women I mentored, but I also didn't want to fracture the bonds at home. One evening, I reflected on a conversation with Mariam. She had said, "Your courage makes me believe in myself, even when everyone around me doubts it." That sentence stayed with me. It reminded me that leadership, at any age, often comes with challenges and resistance. The discomfort I felt at home was not a sign to stop. It was a sign that I was doing something meaningful enough to matter. The contrast between my work and family life sharpened another realization. Impact is rarely confined to one space. The lessons I shared with young women often mirrored the values I had hoped to instill in my own family: patience, resilience, assertiveness, and self-worth. These were universal lessons, and the fact that they were being applied elsewhere did not diminish my role at home. Slowly, I began to accept that my contribution could be meaningful, even if unacknowledged by some members of my family. In the middle of this tension, I also began noticing the small ways in which change was taking root at home. My grandchildren, in particular, started to mirror the confidence and curiosity they saw in me. They would ask thoughtful questions about my workshops, eager to understand what I was teaching others. Even my son began to seek my opinion on decisions at work or in the community, acknowledging my experience in subtle but meaningful ways. It wasn't the dramatic validation I had once sought, but it was enough to remind me that influence can manifest quietly. By the end of those weeks, I had learned that leadership and empowerment weren't without cost, and that growth often comes with friction. The personal sacrifices, the confrontations, the careful negotiation of space, these were all part of the journey. What mattered was that I had chosen to expand my role in the world despite resistance, to claim my voice and impact beyond the walls of my home. Through it all, the feeling of fulfillment was undeniable. Each message from a young woman, each small victory shared, each acknowledgement, public or private, reinforced that this path was necessary. My daughter-in-law's criticism, my son's attempts at mediation, the late nights and early mornings, all of it had become the backdrop for a deeper understanding of what it meant to grow, to lead, and to mentor. The personal cost was real, but so was the impact. And for the first time in years, I felt that both were worth it. I realized then that life didn't demand perfection. It demanded presence, courage, and the willingness to embrace complexity. My role as a mentor, my evolving public identity, and my commitment to family were not mutually exclusive. They were intertwined, forming a life richer than I had imagined when my daughter-in-law first questioned my worth. That night, sitting in the quiet of my home, I understood that tension and reward often coexist, and that navigating both was the essence of growth. So let's get into what happened next. The point when all the guidance, mentoring, and public workshops began to crystallize into something tangible, something permanent. I had spent months organizing notes, anecdotes, and lessons learned from countless conversations with the women I mentored. Every story, every struggle, every small victory had been carefully recorded in journals and digital documents. I realized that the experiences I had accumulated over decades of parenting, both the successes and the mistakes, could serve a larger purpose if I could shape them into a coherent guide. I began drafting outlines for my book late at night, after the household had quieted. The house smelled faintly of tea and old books, the kind of smell that reminded me of libraries I loved as a child. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light, and I felt both anticipation and trepidation. I questioned myself constantly. Was I capable of writing something meaningful? Could my voice resonate beyond the walls of my home? But each note I typed reassured me. The stories were already alive, and my task was simply to give them structure and form. I decided to start with a chapter on empathy in parenting, the lessons I had learned raising my children and the insights I had gained watching young adults struggle to navigate life. I used real-life examples from my mentorship sessions, carefully changing identifying details to protect privacy while retaining the emotional truth. As I wrote, I noticed a rhythm forming. Paragraphs flowed into one another like streams converging into a river. I realized that my late-night reflections, the quiet conversations with mentees, and even the tensions at home had all contributed to the depth of insight I could now share. Submitting the first draft to a friend for feedback was nerve-wracking. She had been a silent supporter throughout my mentorship journey, always encouraging me to trust my experience. When she returned the draft with detailed notes, highlighting both strengths and areas needing clarity, I felt a mixture of relief and renewed purpose. Her comments made me confront the places where I had over-explained, where I had let self-doubt seep into the pages. It was a humbling process, but also empowering. It reminded me that growth, even as a writer, was ongoing. The next stage involved working with an editor. I wanted someone who could preserve my authentic voice while refining the structure. Weeks of collaboration followed, punctuated by long evenings of rewriting chapters, reworking anecdotes, and refining exercises designed to help readers apply the lessons in their own lives. At times, I questioned whether I could sustain the intensity of the project, especially with ongoing mentorship commitments and family responsibilities. But I reminded myself that this book was not only a legacy for my readers, but also a tangible affirmation of my own expertise and life experience. As the manuscript neared completion, I had to confront the logistics of publication. Traditional publishing felt intimidating with its layers of contracts, marketing plans, and deadlines. I considered self-publishing, recognizing that it would require intense work, but also offered control over my message. After weighing the options, I chose a hybrid path, finding a small publishing house that valued my voice while allowing me creative input. This decision brought a new layer of excitement and anxiety. The first proofs arrived in my mailbox, crisp pages filled with text I had shaped painstakingly. Holding them felt surreal, a physical manifestation of years of learning, teaching, and writing. Promotion became the next frontier. Book signings, interviews, podcasts, and community events filled my calendar. My heart raced before each appearance, not out of fear of public speaking. I had grown confident through workshops, but out of anticipation of connecting with readers who might benefit from the guidance I offered. Each event reinforced the purpose behind my work. Readers would approach me, sharing their struggles, their gratitude, and their hope that my book might help them navigate their own lives. Those moments were electric, affirming that my personal journey had expanded far beyond my immediate circle. Amid the publicity and recognition, I kept an eye on the household. The balance between public engagement and private life required constant attention. My daughter-in-law continued to make subtle critiques, questioning the necessity of so many evenings devoted to book events or mentorship sessions. I learned to listen without reacting impulsively, to respond calmly and clearly when necessary, and to reserve energy for what truly mattered: my impact on the lives of others and the integrity of my work. The tension at home never disappeared entirely, but it became a backdrop rather than a barrier. Then came the moment that validated all the late nights, self-doubt, and determination. The book hit the bestseller list. Seeing my name alongside the top authors, reading reviews praising the insights and practical guidance was both thrilling and humbling. Messages flooded in from women across the country who had applied my strategies with transformative results. One reader shared that the advice on communication with adult children had restored peace in her home. Another wrote that my chapters on self-respect had given her the courage to pursue her own career goals. Each message reinforced the ripple effect I had hoped to create, showing that empowerment was contagious. Finally, I allowed myself a quiet reflection. Sitting in my favorite chair by the window, the book resting on the table, I realized how far I had come. From the moment my daughter-in-law's criticism stung, to the late nights mentoring, to writing and publishing a book that touched countless lives, every step was part of a continuous journey of self-assertion and growth. I understood that success was not just about recognition, but about the tangible difference I had made in the lives of others, and the confidence I had reclaimed for myself. The chapter of public affirmation did not erase the challenges at home, but it reshaped my perspective. The value of my experience, my voice, and my efforts was no longer dependent on the approval of those closest to me. I had created something lasting, meaningful, and empowering, both for myself and for those who sought guidance. The book became a bridge, connecting generations, offering tools for navigating relationships, and celebrating the resilience and wisdom that comes with life experience. In that quiet evening, as sunlight waned over the garden and the house hummed with distant activity, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I was no longer just a Mia's other who had been dismissed. I was an author, a mentor, and a guide whose work resonated far beyond the confines of personal judgment. The journey was challenging, demanding, and at times fraught with doubt, but it had led me to a place where my expertise was validated, my voice was amplified, and my life's work was acknowledged in ways I had only dared to hope for. So let's get into what happened as the final pieces of this journey came together. the moment when my public achievements intersected with my private life in ways I had long anticipated but never fully imagined. With the book published, bestseller accolades received, and workshops continuing to thrive, I realized it was time to confront the lingering tension at home. My daughter-in-law's critiques, once sharp and unrelenting, had evolved into a quiet curiosity. She noticed my schedule, my success, and the growing circle of women who looked to me for guidance. What had once been judgment now carried the faintest trace of recognition, though unspoken and subtle. I arranged a casual family gathering, nothing formal, just an afternoon tea in the sunlit dining room. The air was tinged with the scent of fresh pastries, brewed coffee, and the subtle fragrance of flowers I had placed on the table. My children arrived, a mixture of curiosity and polite restraint in their manner. The dynamic felt different from months before. There was an unspoken tension, but it was no longer one-sided. I had spent so long anticipating confrontation that I now approached it with calm, understanding that my presence, my accomplishments, and my voice already spoke louder than any argument could. During the gathering, I shared stories of recent workshops, subtle anecdotes of transformations I had witnessed among mentees, and feedback from readers who had applied my guidance. I watched carefully for reactions. My daughter-in-law, who had once dismissed my experience, asked a question, almost tentatively, about how I had structured the book. There was a flicker of genuine interest, and I chose to answer with measured warmth, highlighting insights that could apply to everyday parenting and adult relationships. I noticed my children leaning in, listening in ways they had not in years. The table no longer carried tension. It had shifted toward engagement, curiosity, and recognition, even if silent. Over the next few weeks, interactions at home subtly changed. Conversations began to include me, seeking advice on situations they previously would have handled independently or ignored entirely. I responded with guidance, but also with restraint, allowing them to absorb and reflect rather than dictating solutions. This approach felt like reclaiming my role on my own terms, not seeking approval, but asserting the value of my experience through action and influence. I realized that my efforts outside the home had created a quiet credibility I could now leverage at home, not through confrontation, but through demonstration of knowledge and care. Simultaneously, my mentoring and book-related activities continued to expand. Invitations to speak at local organizations, webinars, and community programs provided ongoing opportunities to share insights. I began to see patterns emerge in the challenges faced by young adults and their parents, recognizing that my guidance addressed gaps not only in practical skills, but also in communication, empathy, and confidence. Each new connection reinforced the purpose of my work, and I carried that energy back into family interactions, which now felt less fraught and more collaborative. There was a particular evening that crystallized the transformation. My daughter-in-law asked me to advise on an issue with one of her children, a situation I could have addressed months earlier but would have been dismissed outright. I approached it with care, offering practical strategies and emotional support. As we navigated the discussion, I sensed a subtle shift in her attitude, respect and acknowledgement replacing prior criticism. It was not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet validation of the years of patience, mentorship, and personal growth that had led to this moment. I recognized that true influence was earned through consistency, not confrontation, and that empowerment often arrives silently before recognition follows. Reflecting on this, I understood that my journey had always been about more than publishing a book or achieving professional validation. It was about reclaiming authority over my own experience, demonstrating the enduring value of lived wisdom, and creating tangible outcomes that impacted both the lives of strangers and the dynamics within my family. My daughter-in-law's critique, once a source of frustration, had inadvertently catalyzed a transformation that encompassed self-discovery, public recognition, and ultimately, subtle reconciliation. One afternoon, I sat quietly in my study, the book resting beside me. Notes from upcoming workshops spread across the desk. I allowed myself to review the journey from the first sting of criticism to this point of equilibrium. The reflection was not about victory over others, but about the consolidation of my own voice, the validation of my expertise, and the creation of a legacy defined by action and knowledge. The journey had transformed not only how others perceived me, but also how I perceived myself: confident, experienced, and resilient. I thought about the women I had mentored, the readers who had written to express gratitude, and the countless small victories that had been invisible to anyone outside those lives. Their stories intertwined with mine, reinforcing that empowerment grows exponentially when shared. I realized that my daughter-in-law, my children, and even extended family were secondary witnesses to a narrative that primarily belonged to me, a narrative in which I had regained authority, influence, and fulfillment. As the sun set over the garden, I prepared for a small celebratory gathering with close friends who had supported my journey from the beginning. There was laughter, shared memories, and acknowledgement of the collective effort that had enabled this chapter of life. My children observed quietly, witnessing without interruption the community I had cultivated, the recognition I had earned, and the tangible outcomes of years of dedication to mentoring and writing. In that moment, the subtle shifts in perception within the family were evident. Respect, curiosity, and acknowledgement, however restrained, had replaced dismissiveness. The final reflection was clear. Empowerment and influence are most enduring when rooted in personal growth, perseverance, and purposeful action. I no longer needed constant validation from those closest to me because my impact had been affirmed in multiple arenas, through readers, mentees, and the tangible success of my published work. Family recognition, though welcome, was now an adjunct rather than a prerequisite. I had achieved a self-defined success, merging private triumph with public accomplishment, and in doing so, had redefined my role both within my family and in the broader community. Sitting back, I felt a profound sense of closure. The path that began with criticism had unfolded into empowerment, influence, and self-realization. Every late night seance, I'd spent drafting chapters, mentoring others, and navigating the delicate balance of family dynamics had culminated in a life-altering affirmation. My experience mattered, my voice resonated, and my actions created meaningful change. The subtle acknowledgement from family, coupled with tangible recognition from the public, reinforced that wisdom and perseverance are the truest measures of achievement. I closed the journal I had kept alongside my writing notes and gazed out the window at the twilight settling over the garden. The journey from criticism to empowerment was complete, leaving me not only with a best-selling book, but with a renewed sense of purpose, self-respect, and enduring influence. I had transformed the sting of rejection into a platform for growth, teaching, and leadership, and in doing so, had secured a legacy defined by action, insight, and unwavering self-belief. Just like I discovered my own voice and turned criticism into empowerment, there's another story where a mother faces being dismissed in her own home and finds an unexpected way to reclaim her influence. If you want to see how quiet resilience can quietly transform family dynamics, don't miss this next journey. It's full of surprising insights and emotional payoffs,